Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Megan Bem, a book club manager with PBC Guru, and I am so thrilled to be talking today with Matt Haig, the author of many, many books, including the New York Times bestselling book, The Midnight Library, the internationally bestselling memoir, Reasons to Stay Alive, as well as 5 other novels and several award-winning children's books. Matt studied English and history at the University of Hull and has a master's degree in English literature from Leeds University. His work has been translated into more than 40 languages. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Megan. This is an absolute pleasure, and thanks to everyone who's watching this. It's great. It's been one of the few joys in this year to be able to sort of sit in my living room on a cold, rainy day in Brighton, England, and be able to do these events in different places in the world. So, yes, thank you very much for having me.
Great. So just a reminder for everyone watching, the topics that Matt and I will discuss are based on comments and ideas all of our book club members have suggested in the forum in the weeks leading up to this event. But if you think of something new you would like to ask Matt as we're discussing things, please enter your questions or comments in the Ask a Question box, and we will answer those questions in the second half of our chat. I can't promise that we'll get to everyone, but I will do my best. So Matt, first of all, I would love to start with the origin story for the Midnight Library. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, you know, it sounds ridiculous and it's going to make me sound ancient, but Midnight Library is something like my 20th book. They're not all novels. I've written children's books and different things, but it was a long time coming. And while I was writing other books, I'd always wanted to write a parallel life story, a sort of multiverse story, but I didn't really have a hook. And the thing is, there are so many amazing parallel life stories out there, both in novels, in films. It's a Wonderful Life. Kate Atkinson's novel Life After Life was something I was thinking about as well. There's all loads and loads and loads of great stuff. So I thought, I'm not going to write my parallel life story because I just don't have a good enough idea. And then I would love to have an amazing origin story about how I came up with the library, but I didn't really. I mean, I had various sort of fictional libraries in my head, I suppose. There's a short story by Borges, The Library of Babel, which is about an infinite library. There's different things, but for whatever reason, it was just there. One morning, I thought, a library where you pull the different books off the shelf, and each book is a different version of your life. And the reason I liked that is because I thought, well, that is what a library is. You know, that is what a library is. You know, we don't actually access the multiverse, but we kind of do, because when we're reading, we are accessing other worlds. So we are literally trying out different lives. And I think that's one of the reasons we like to read, is because in a very sort of safe way, we can literally enter someone else's life. We can become that person, whether they're going through amazing times or serious challenges. And by doing that, we get a new perspective on our own life. So I thought the Midnight Library itself was a neat metaphor for that anyway. And so once I had that, I thought, yes, I'm going to write this. It's going to be tough because the challenge was how you make each life not feel like just a short story and make it feel like a novel. But once I got that, I thought, right, I've got to write it.
Cool. So the multiverse theory is definitely fascinating, but it's not something that everyone has heard of. So you wanted to write a multiverse book. Where does your interest in the multiverse come from?
I don't know. I mean, I was someone who was really bad at science at school. I was put off science by school. It was almost like, at my school, it was almost like West Side Story, where instead of jets and sharks, you had science and maths people, math, I should say, to an American, science and mathematics people, or you had your sort of artsy weirdos like me. And then never the twain shall meet, and you were either science or you were bookish, sort of reading Stephen King novels. And yeah, I was an adult before I discovered that I like science and I like multiverse theory. And it was actually a book by an American author, I think it's called Brian Greene, who wrote a book called The Hidden Reality. That's about multiverse theory, this whole book. And a lot of modern science books actually are quite poetic because they're about uncertainty and I was just very inspired about that. And I'm someone who, not now, but in the past, I have had lots of regrets. I mean, I've been very open about it. When I was younger, I had mental health issues quite seriously. I mean, I still occasionally have anxiety now and patches of depression, but I had a full-blown breakdown at the age of 24, 25, 26. And that was traumatic to live through. But one thing it gave me was a sort of sense of, a sort of philosophical sense about life in terms of how you end up in certain places, how you get out of certain places. And it made me embrace uncertainty, because we think of uncertainty as this negative force in life, and we want sort of control over our lives and this, that, and the other. But actually, uncertainty can keep you alive. Uncertainty when you're depressed, and the depression is saying everything is going to be bleak, or you won't make it through another year, or this, that, and the other, whatever that voice of negativity says. Uncertainty is the thing that untangles that and actually breaks you out of that. And then you do live to be the age of 25 and 30, and then you say, depression, I disproved you. I lived a different universe. And I like the idea that actually, although we don't physically enter different universes and come back to this one, we do actually all the time enter different universes. With every decision we make, we slightly change the world and our lives. And I love all that stuff.
Well, thank you for sharing. That's wonderful. Yeah, we had a lot of interesting conversations and thoughts that people had about regrets. I think that's something that we all at some point, get consumed by. And it was definitely an interesting part of the book, Nora learning how to process those feelings. And
yeah, I mean, a lot of her regrets are well, they're not really my regrets. They're slightly different. But one of them was the music one, because there was a chance she could have been in a sort of band which she imagined could have been successful. So there was one life where, and the great thing about multiverse theory is you can go anywhere. Even the most unlikely version of your life, if it is physically possible, it's happening somewhere else. So I'm going to have fun with that. So there's going to be one life where she's like this massive Olympic swimmer, was rock star, glaciologist, all of that. But anyway, the rock star life, that was slightly my wish fulfillment one, because I was a little bit musical when I was younger. I played the piano, but then I gave up at a crucial age. I gave up at about 13 years old because I was suddenly like a self-conscious teenage boy, and it wasn't a cool thing to go on a Friday evening to Mrs. Peters' piano class. And so, yeah, I gave that up and didn't pick up the piano until like my 40s. I'm 45 now. So I'm back doing the piano, but I'm never going to be Elton John. And yes, I have to live with that. But no, it's fine. I think the world has been saved.
So you mentioned in what you just said, that you have your own experiences with mental health issues, and you have written about that. I read Reasons to Stay Alive earlier this year, and I was thinking about those two books in tandem, and was wondering how the process was different for you. You've written so many books at this point. How is writing? There are themes that overlapped, but writing it as a memoir and writing it as a fictional story, I'm curious about that relationship and how they're different or how they're similar even.
It's very interesting because, like, the weird thing about fiction is you can actually sometimes, one of the incentives to write fiction is sometimes to tell the truth. And it sounds a paradox, but like in terms of mental health, yes, I have written about my own direct experience of mental health. And in Reasons to Stay Alive, I am honest about what I went through, and I was suicidal for a while, and had diagnosed with panic disorder. I was on diazepam. Various things happened to me, and that was a very cathartic thing to write. It was kind of therapeutic thing to write. But writing The Midnight Library was very different, and in a way, it's freer when you're writing about. When I'm writing about something that's personal, but you're not writing it via you. Mm-hmm. I think one of the reasons Nora is female, and I risked, being a male writer, writing a female main character, is because I needed it to be very clearly not me. I needed it wasn't me. And it's always risky doing that. But in a way, it was freeing because I actually ended up being more autobiographical with Nora than I was in the very first draft. This was the very first draft of Midnight Library, which I never completed. But when I started writing the Midnight Library, it was a male protagonist, a little bit older than Nora's age, very similar to me and where I am in life. And I just could not see this character. I could not feel this character at all. And one warning sign when you're writing a book is if the name of the main character is changing all the time. So this person, he was an Adam, he was different things. And I thought, this character's not there. And the reason he wasn't there was because it was me. It's like if you look at your face too long in the mirror or on a Zoom call or whatever,
right,
you no longer know what you look like.
right.
You can't step out. You can never literally step outside of yourself to actually see you as other people see you. And when you're writing a character that's close to you, it can be like that. So it's not a character. It's kind of just an amalgam of human things. And so as soon as I just changed gender, name, age, all those things, it became clear that this person wasn't me. And so in a strange way, it gave a green card. So at the start of the book, which, I mean, it does start pretty bleak, you know, with her going through these depressive feelings, a lot of that was very autobiographical. I'm not from the town, Bedford. I mean, Bedford was basically me just paying my reference to It's a Wonderful Life because it's Bedford Falls and It's a Wonderful Life. So the town is Bedford. It's a real town in England. It's kind of known for being your average mundane small town community. And I'm very used to those sort of small towns. But my town was another town just south of London called Croydon, where I used to work. And I used to have these oppressive grey skies. And when I started getting depressed, I was in this town and wandering around. And there was a lot of that. A lot of it in the book ended up shrinking because that depressing bit, as people call it, at the start of the book is about... It was in the first, it's about 28 pages in the edition what we have now, but originally it was something like 70 pages because I was sort of using it as a therapy session and I was like, oh, yeah. But it was the version where she actually got mugged and, you know, no. She got, I just piled on the misery. It was just like, and my editors on both sides of the Atlantic said, yeah, that's not going to, it's just, people are just going to be throwing that book away. It's just
right.
It's
killing her cat is bad enough.
We need the bleak bit, but
right.
shrink it.
Right.
So and then some people say, "Oh, it's so long." The bit at the beginning. It's like, guys, that was like 4 times longer.
It's so interesting to hear you say that because I do think the number one question I got was why was Nora a woman? And why did you decide to write from that perspective? And that makes total sense. That makes complete sense to me. So that's really interesting. So you talked a little bit about, you know, sort of all the different iterations of her life and how, you know, it could be the most extreme version. Was there any one of them that was particularly fun to write?
Yeah. I mean, I should also just say last thing on the gender thing. Yeah, it was scary because I know how badly me and other male writers can get it, even when it's not a main character. I mean, you obviously, every book pretty much has female characters in it, but when you're writing from a perspective, any perspective that's not your own, you have to be sensitive to. You have to be sensitive to. And there's so many traps and ways you can get it wrong without realizing you've got it wrong. I mean, I'm particularly lucky that my most brutal reader is my wife, and she's a writer too, and she's a journalist, and she will just tell me. And there was a lot of stuff I was being typical male writer, getting things wrong, and yeah, a lot of eye-rolling moments from Andrea. So I was lucky that I had like one of the harshest readers right at the start to sort of sort that out. But yeah, sorry. On to what was the
thank you.
Recap of the question.
I was just curious if there was one of her alternate lives that you most enjoyed living in or writing, or was there one that sort of surprised you?
I kind of liked the stuff where she was a glaciologist. I mean, when I read it through now, I think, oh, I might have overdone that life, because although a lot of the lives are short, I liked the idea that they would be short, that she'd have these sort of like blinks. It's almost like your life going through through, flashing through your eyes, but it's all the different possible lives. I like that. The rock star one in Brazil where she's doing a rock concert, that was just total wish fulfillment of me pretending I was a rock star. The most sort of like emotional life to write was the one which was in some ways the most ordinary, where she is a parent and she's married, and it's quite conventional. And interestingly, that was one of the few remnants from the very first draft where it was a male character. So that domestic set, and originally that was going to be kind of like the absolute ending, and it was different. But as soon as the character came female, I was just like, no, it's just not right to do that. And I just, but that was the hardest but most interesting life to write, even though it's not set in a magical setting or it's not particularly exotic or crazy. It was like the most difficult because it's a life that she doesn't end up living, but it's not in any way wrong, but it's still not quite the fit for her precisely. And that was the challenging one, because it's very easy to write the lives where it was kind of wish fulfillment, but then something was tragically wrong, like someone had dead in this life who wasn't dead in another life or something like that. So it was simple, be careful what you wish for stuff. And I definitely wanted some of that, but it was more slightly interesting but more difficult to write the lives which actually weren't particularly bad. They were just not quite hers. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And that's also where we meet Hugo, who is very intriguing.
Yes, Hugo. And when I started writing Hugo, I thought, I could write my own Hugo novel, because Hugo was quite Hugo was a useful character in some ways, because he's the one who's like her. He's the one who's like her, but been like her for longer. And so he's got all the explanations. And so I could explain things in dialogue rather than having to be too expositional. And he was fun to write. And he's the one that made me feel like, I'm writing a sci-fi as well. Like it felt like a genre novel, or, the old TV show Quantum Leap. It felt like I was doing that. And he was great. I mean, he's a stereotype really, because he's French and he's all sort of charming. And so I should have also had a French reader for my cultural stereotyping. But no, he was fun to write.
So you mentioned briefly in what you were just discussing that there are some things that carry over from one life to another. There are some that don't. And this was something that we had a lot of different questions about. So this is sort of a big question, but I am curious about, for example, like Izzy shows up in some versions, but not in others. In some versions, her brother is around, and some he isn't. But then in all of her lives, her mother is gone, I believe. And so I was curious about what you were trying to say with what, as you said, be careful what you wish for, that some things will change in ways you expect and some things will change in ways you don't expect. I'm just curious.
Yeah. I mean, that's the central theme, basically. It's about how you just don't know. And I imagine that was just how I imagined it would be. Like if you could literally go back 10 years and change a decision, and then you ended up here again, then some things would be absolutely the same, I think. And other things would be wildly different, but they wouldn't be the things you'd predicting were different. So I suppose the reason I wrote this as a kind of self-therapy and hopefully as a comfort to other people is because, like, you can waste so much of your life, can't you? You can waste so much of your life regretting something. Like I never got the exam results I needed at school to get into a great university that my parents wanted me to get in, and I wanted to get in. But then if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have met my wife, who's actually, this is going to sound so sentimental. She did kind of save my life. My wife saved my life. I wouldn't have got through my breakdown. I can't imagine how I would have got through my breakdown without her. And that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't failed earlier on in my life. So things that seem very horrendous or like failures or rejections we get in the present, you never know. And the older you get, you realize this more, I think. And now I'm like in my full midlife crisis zone at 45 years old. I sort of see how the shape of life a little bit more, and how you genuinely don't know. I mean, even those 3 worst years of my life where I was very ill and suicidal and depressed, I would never want to relive that, and I'd never wish it upon anyone. But also, I have known more happiness this side of that, and not despite that, almost because of it, because my recovery made me appreciate things about life and made me feel a sense of gratitude for normal life and for people that I didn't know before. And I sometimes think about my own parents as well, because my own parents were both, in a sense, in one sense, they were both dropouts. My dad went to like the top university, went to Oxford University, but he never finished his course. He dropped out. He had an epileptic fit, and then he got lots of stress, and he realized he wasn't doing the right course, and he disappointed his whole family, and he left university, and he changed course, and he decided he wanted to be an architect. So he went to a much more ordinary university, Sheffield, and he studied there. My mum, she wanted to be an actor on the stage. She went to drama school in Bristol. Then she couldn't hack it. Then she dropped out to teacher training college. So these 2 dropouts who met in a pub in Sheffield in England, and I'm very glad they both dropped out, because I wouldn't exist without these 2, and that disappointed their families at the time, and disappointed them, but they wouldn't want to undo me and my sister who exist because of that. So I think when you think back, we're not here just because of successes. We're here because of a long line of failures and things that haven't quite worked. And I think that's a much more philosophical way of looking at life. And it certainly helped me this last year, this year of lockdown, which, collectively as a world, as a species, we've been going through this thing, which has made us all sort of contemplate how we cope with things when times aren't so great. And I think one way is to actually say, well, we never know. We don't know. Actually, something good might come out of this challenging situation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you just sort of mentioned, the philosophy. Oh, God, sorry, got tongue-tied. The philosophy of the book, and we did have many questions about the philosophers that you reference in the book. Someone just dropped in the chat that they were curious about specifically using Thoreau and how much Thoreau pops up. And so I was curious if there are philosophers that you are particularly fond of, and if there are any that helped you through the last year. Any reasons why he pops up so much? Yeah.
I love Thoreau. Thoreau is obviously he's more well known your side of the pond, because like in Britain, shame to say, not many people have heard of Henry David Thoreau, and those who have very much see him as an American entity, links with Emerson and different people. And I first came across Thoreau when I was a young person, and there was a particular quote, the one about sucking the marrow out of life, and very sort of life-affirming quote about making the most out of life. And I totally misread that quote when I was young. I thought that meant, go out, go crazy, have your tequila, go wild, go and live in Spain, do this, that, and the other. He meant the opposite of that. And it took me a whole breakdown to come out the other side to actually realize what he was meaning within that quote. And, he meant, in his case, go to the cabin in the woods, retreat, head towards solitude, and then you can live. Then you feel most alive. And I was like, no, you need the music really loud. You need to have the spiciest food, travel the world, do this and the other. And actually, I realized myself in later life, that often what you need to live isn't to add. It's to sort of simplify. It's to edit. It's to have the sort of acoustic set version of your life. And you'll hear yourself more, and you'll see yourself more. And so that's what I take from Thoreau. That's sort of like that. Intelligent simplicity, that kind of, I wouldn't be able to do what he did, go into the woods and, I'm the least practical person. I can't drive.
He wasn't that far away from a town, though, if I remember correctly.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so he's eating a little bit, it's like the sort of Bear Grylls.
Right.
I
think I read recently that he lived relatively close to his mom and she would bring him cookies once a week or something like that. So he really had it figured out, man.
Yeah, but I know, but and he probably was a right old bore in real life, wasn't he? Just going on about but that's what I took. I when I'm getting romantic about nature, I like that stuff. I spend a lot of my life, actually. I wrote another book called The Humans, where it was all about Emily Dickinson. And obviously Emily Dickinson, again, is someone that's more famous in America than the UK, although that's changing a bit. And I basically like to take, I've got a lot of sort of American influences that I'm educating British people about. Anyway, yes, but philosophers, well, yeah. I mean, I sort of want my cake and eat it as well with a book. So I want to write a story that hopefully is entertaining, but that can also within that make people think about stuff and philosophize. And so often the easiest, maybe even laziest way to do that is to actually bring in philosophers. So it was very easy for me to make Nora a philosophy student, because then she could talk about different themes and different stuff. And yeah, I mean, I love it. I mean, one thing that got me through lockdown was the great American podcast called Philosophize This, which is just a history of Western and some Eastern philosophy. And I used to just sort of go on long runs and listen about Socrates and Aristotle and Thoreau and Simone de Beauvoir and different people. And yeah, I'm fascinated by that. And I think we've all become a bit, I feel like one thing about lockdown, I've noticed other people say it as well, that we've become a bit more contemplative and philosophical. I think we don't do enough of that in the modern age because we're not encouraged to. We're encouraged to be consumers. And, and we don't actually think about the big macro stuff. And I probably am too much the other way, but yeah.
Great. I want to circle back to something you were saying about, this is going back a few minutes, but we had a lot of questions from book club members about the decision to drop Nora down into each life without like having the download of what had led up to that moment. So she would be the same age, but she wouldn't necessarily know how she got there. And I had a lot of folks that were curious about why you made that decision.
Yeah, it's one of my most controversial choices. Some people really like it. Some people really think, why on earth? It's just so frustrating and stressful. But I felt like I had to do that. Well, two reasons. There's one, just a poetic reason. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's a kind of metaphor for what I often feel like. I often feel like I'm dropped into my own life sometimes. Like I'm just sort of like, I'm somewhere and I'm like halfway through a Zoom meeting. I'm thinking, what am I doing here? Why am I here? You know, and sort of like that ultimate philosophical question of what am I doing here? You know, and she'd had that. And I thought it'd be quite fun, especially in the social media age, how much she could actually quickly find out about herself by going on her phone and being a detective of her own life. So I thought it was a bit fun and a bit philosophical, but also I thought practically, I just felt that's how it would work. Like it would be, you know, because if she's becoming literally, I won't go into too much depth, but if she's becoming literally that person, like she can remember everything since she was born, so she's becoming another person, what's the through line with her root life, the original life? Like, would she be two Noras side by side inside the same head? And that was just a bit too mind-boggling, and I needed to be a different type of writer to write that. So I felt like it's almost like a continual fish out of water thing where she's actually inhabiting that life. And yes, I know we lose something in the sense that she can't fully judge precisely what that version of Nora is. But that's almost kind of the point, because she's then trying to like place herself with her prior knowledge into this new life to actually assess it from her own perspective, because these are the dreams she's had in her root life. And so she actually gets to step foot in them, but she is stepping foot in them. So she hasn't got the million memories of how the band started or everything else. She's getting to that point. And I felt in a way, she'll actually know more about whether it's the right decision by not having the full build up, joining it at a point down the line to see how it ended up. you know, sometimes we lose ourselves in our own narratives, and you know, we come to terms with things. So we kind of tell ourselves each life is the right life, and how. So it'd be kind of interesting to just jump her into that life. So obviously there were various decisions I had to make like that, and there's no right ones, and there's a few that I regret, or a few I wish I'd done the other way. But that's just my thinking in the time why I chose to do that.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. That makes sense. I was so obsessed with in the Olympic swimmer line. I was like, what happened in Portugal? I just like, I was so fascinated by it, you know, and the fact that we don't really get an answer.
I love doing that. I mean, that's another thing that can annoy people, and that's fair enough.
I thought that was great. You know, she never learns, and neither do we. Yeah,
exactly. And I feel like that's kind of what life is like as well, you know, because I know a lot of people like to have everything sewn up and everything, but and sometimes it's a bit laziness on an author's part. You're not, but sometimes that is just gives it a feel of life, isn't it? Like you find out, you hear something, and it's never quite resolved, and you know, and so she would be having that continually. I've just seen there's a Mrs. Elm question. Can I answer?
Yes, I was about to segue into that. Yeah,
Julia Cutler's Mrs. Elm question. Who does Mrs. Elm represent? Mrs. Elm. I think Mrs. Elm, for me, Mrs. Elm more than Nora, if anything, is kind of the book, because Mrs. Elm is, well, for a start, I like the fact that Nora's called Nora Seed, and then Mrs. Elm is the sort of tree, right. The elm tree, with all the sort of branches at her disposal. But also, Mrs. Elm, the personality came from two people in my own head. One was my grandmother, who was very lovely, but she was a kind of tough love person. Mm-hmm. You know, she was who you went to if you had a wobbly tooth, and she'd love pulling out your tooth. Right. She was old school. She used to do it, tie it to the door handle thing. Sorry, I should have had a trigger warning.
No, it's all good. That's very vivid.
dental content warning. But no, she had, and also my English teacher as a teenager. I had a really good teacher who, when I was at your equivalent of middle school, and I showed my creative writing to her, and she was literally the only person I dared show my creative writing to, and she gave me confidence and everything. So a lot of her mannerisms were her. But yeah, when Julia asks if she's got a spiritual, godly dimension, well, obviously, you know, I wanted to make that ambiguous, which is annoying, isn't it? But she kind of is and isn't. She's kind of like the angel in It's a Wonderful Life. Mm-hmm. But she's also the universe itself, and she's also this person who means a lot to Nora in her own life. You know, someone she's actually known. But there's kind of two Mrs. Elms in the book. There's the Mrs. Elm who she actually knew in the real root life, and then there's this symbolic figure. And what I basically was very mindful of, more than the God analogy, was the sort of therapy analogy, because Mrs. Elm is basically offering the greatest sort of therapy course imaginable. So she's this kind of multiversal exposure therapy where she can literally see how things would go on. So that's basically it. And I have heard people sort of say, oh, it's a little bit easy, you know, because like Nora, she's had depression one day, and then she might not have depression, and she goes through. And my explanation for that is, well, she hasn't just gone, you know, she's gone through literally hundreds. By the end of it, she's gone through hundreds. She's tried hundreds of different lives, had hundreds of different experiences. And between them all, she's been having these therapy sessions, which are, you know, Mrs. Elm is like the uber therapist, like the ultimate therapist. And so that's sort of it was my sort of dream therapist. There's someone who's had mixed experiences of therapy. Mrs. Elm was my sort of dream therapy session. So writing those in between chapters was actually more important to me than writing the other bits, the lives, because it was like, oh, I'm back in therapy now, and like I felt that that it's the most sort of simplistic part of the book. It's almost like a children's book or a fable when you're in the library and Mrs. Elm. And I was deliberately trying to make the dialogue as simplistic as possible, as simple, as sort of clear and pure and simple, because I wanted her to have this sort of very a very clear kind of authority to her. And yeah, so I really liked writing Mrs. Ham, basically.
Yeah. You mention in the book, or I guess Hugo mentions in the book, that for different people, it's a different place. You know, for Nora, it's a library. For him, it was a video store. For other people, it's a record store. I can't help but ask, what would your midnight library be?
Well, my dream ones would be, and it's boring, it'd either be the video store or the library, because they were my places. They were my two places. I grew up in a town in the 1980s, early 90s, which even in a land of boring towns is the winner. It's the most boring town in the whole of England. It's changed a lot now. And I very much doubt anyone from Newark-on-Trent is listening to this, but maybe they are. But anyway, my parents still live there, so I always get in trouble for talking about Newark-on-Trent the way I do. But the fact is that in the 1980s and early 90s, there wasn't even a bookstore.
Oh my gosh.
There wasn't a cinema. There wasn't a theater. There wasn't anything culturally going on. But what it did have, it had a library and it had a video store. And so they were my two places. My parents both worked, and they both worked late. So I was kind of a latchkey kid. And I would go from school straight to the library. And the library for me wasn't just about books. It was just like, I think the value of libraries is as a space. You know, it's kind of like a secular church. You go to a library and I do. I feel like safe. I feel like this is a space in the public sphere that doesn't just want money from me. It's not a shop. It's a place where you can just be. And, you know, so it is like that sort of secular place of being. And the video store, yeah. We used to be this little video store called Tracks, and I used to go and I used to, you know, whatever it was, I don't know, some terrible Jean-Claude Van Damme movie or whatever. I was obsessed. I was obsessed with movies, and I was obsessed with going to the video store almost more than I was with watching movies. I used to like the possibilities, and I suppose like the same. You know, people talk about the books they like, yes, but also there's an experience of walking through the possible books and reading.
Oh, absolutely.
The books, and you know, all the books we haven't read but we kind of know little bits about, and I love that feeling. Yeah, me too. We had a question in the chat way early on that I want to just circle back to because I think it's interesting in terms of your writing process. Were there any parallel lives you cut? Yeah, because you know there's that chapter near the end, which proved a bit controversial with my editors, where you go through lots and lots of lives, like each life like a sentence. Originally, that chapter was about 30 pages long because I was like, writing, and like it was the American editor in particular said, "What's going on here?" It's all good, but that chapter's got it. And so basically, yeah. I could have gone on for ages, actually. There probably were still about 2 or 3 I could have cut with hindsight, but I could have gone on forever, because that was the fun part for me. It was like a choose your own adventure. So I'm trying to think of specifics, what there were. There was a life where she was a chef. I was a chef life. There was a life where there was a life where she'd ended up in prison. There was a life. There was different outcomes that I hadn't done. Yeah, there were other ones. Stunt woman. There was a stunt woman. So I was just getting a bit carried away. Already I was going carried away because in that chapter I can remember it's like there's a life where she's in Cirque du Soleil. There's a life where I don't know, she's in Colombia doing something, and I did enjoy doing that. But I think I also did need a bit of restraint. Like some people say, you know, it's quite a short novel, and it is, but it kind of needed to be a short novel. You could go, yeah. Like you have to, as a writer, you have to also be a reader as you're writing it. I think, we've got enough lives here.
We've had several questions in the chat now about Nora's relationship with her brother and her parents. and questions about, can you speak a little bit to how you created those relationships with her family members?
Yeah. Well, I think that sort of always makes characters interesting, isn't it? I mean, if you want to define a character very quickly, you think about their family relationships.
Mm.
And I think, when you're talking about regrets and expectations of somebody, a lot of that comes from our childhood. It comes from who we became as children, what was put on us as children. And part of therapy, part of recovery, part of self-acceptance, part of adulthood is learning that those things don't have to define you. So in Nora's case, obviously her father wanted her to be an Olympic swimmer and wanted her to sort of like fulfill his ambition. That didn't happen because he was a sports person. He played rugby, which is obviously more of a British sport than an American one. But he had an injury. He couldn't do it. And then so that dashed hope, and that's one of the worst things that parents do, but it's one of the most inevitable things that parents do. The things that they didn't quite work out for them,
right.
They somehow fix and repair and correct in the children. And that's definitely happened in my case with my parents. And I no longer resent them for that. It's just like, it's an understandable, inevitable thing. And I have to watch myself now. I'm a parent thinking, oh, you should do this or do less of that. And you try and correct the things that you didn't do right. So we don't have alternate versions of our life to go through. But if there's a child there, we want to sort of steer them. And you have to be mindful of that. But yes, so Nora's dealing with that. And I thought that would be a very interesting thing to do, to sort of like how she comes to terms with that. And the fact that, and I also thought it would be interesting for one of her parents, for her to have a chance to speak to again. So there's the scene with her father. So it almost becomes like a ghost story because she's actually talking with someone that she's grieved. And, but it helped her come to terms with things in a different way. But at the same point, I also thought that in this wish fulfillment fantasy, which it sort of is, she has a life where she can't bring someone back. She can't bring her mother back. And she still, and so she realizes that there's some things that had just gone. And so it became a bit about grief and stuff. But yeah, I have to admit, though, it's always although it's important, it's always the hardest for me to get the parent-child relationship. It takes me so long to work it out. And and it was definitely the case here. Like the Nora Mrs. Elm relationship was just kind of there from the start, but then working out who her parents are and stuff, I found that much difficult. The thing I found much easier was I find sibling relationships for some reason. I find it quite easier to write siblings. So I got the sort of problematic but loving bond between her and Joe, her brother, and I really liked exploring that and how he was at a different level of happiness in each life too,
right?
And how that was very responsive. Because I feel like that. I feel like we always focus on parents or kids, but actually sibling relationships, for those of us who have siblings, are so defining. It's such an interesting relationship because it's not a very straightforward, pure. It is absolutely love, but it's not the straightforward, pure parent-child love. It's often presented as rivalries and marks against each other and all of that stuff. And yet, at the same time, your genetic makeup, you're so close as well. Right. Gone through so much of the same generation. And I love writing about siblings. In fact, I'm thinking of writing a book. This is a bit of an exclusive for those of you who care about. Right. I mean, it's totally ridiculous, but about Hansel and Gretel, and about Gretel as an adult, and she's agoraphobic, and then she hears Hansel somewhere else, and Gretel has to get to Hansel. So that'd be the ultimate sibling story. Anyway,
I would read that. There's a question here that I'm just going to read because I think it's really well articulated. At the end of the book, Nora returns to her root life. Do you think all sliders ultimately belong in their root life, or do some sliders, like Hugo, have parallel lives where they are ultimately happy?
Yeah, well, Hugo certainly thinks he's happy. I mean, that was the idea. I felt like, to be honest, though, it wasn't published, but I did write a sort of extra chapter about Hugo where he wakes into his root life, and he's been in this coma, and he wakes into his root life. He sees his father, and he's got problematic. So I feel like with Hugo, the reason he's a slider and he keeps hopping between different lives is because he's got something unresolved. So he kind of needs the therapy, and he hasn't quite got it right yet. And I almost feel like you kind of wake up, or you kind of back in your root life, or you kind of stay forever in one life as soon as you've resolved something. And so I feel like Hugo was kind of like the younger me who just always wanted to escape things and kind of like wanted the next adventure, the next adventure, the next adventure. And the reason why wasn't because he was incredibly fun or adventurous. It was because he just couldn't settle within himself. And I think that's a particular thing for me. Whether that's a typical young man thing, I don't know. But I was very much that person. Those people often seem great fun. And you think, oh God, they're the happiest people on earth, and they're always out and they're having adventures and they're doing this and they're off to Mexico and blah, blah. And actually, it's just because they can't sit with themselves for 5 minutes. Actually,
yeah, that's an excellent point. We've got a few questions coming in, and I would love to shift to talking a little bit about you as a writer and your process. So how do you talked a little bit about the inspiration for the Midnight Library, but I am and about the differences between fiction and nonfiction, but I am curious about how you outline or plan your books. What is that process like for you?
I have to say, I'm at the more improvised end of the scale. I'm very impressed when I see these thriller writers who have like these boards, and it's almost like the police. They've got
right.
They've got all these like flow charts and things coming off, and I want to be more like that. But in reality, I write in a very improvised way, and I don't always write chronologically either. So how I start is like, if I have an idea in my head, and if I have a scene in my head, I don't necessarily know how I'm going to get to that scene. But if it's the most vivid scene I have in my head, like with Midnight Library, I didn't start at the beginning. I started when she entered the library and she was sort of walking around the library, and imagine that was the first scene I wrote. And that was just because it was the most vivid thing and the most exciting thing for me to write in that moment. And I didn't have a clue about the other lives. And I start writing it before I get the sort of structure. My favorite quote about writing was a French writer, Françoise Sagan, who wrote Bonjour Tristesse and lots of other books. And she said, I have to write in order to think, meaning she had to be sort of like caught up in a book before she could sort of, know where she was going and what she was doing. And I think the absolute joy of writing fiction is those moments of surprise which aren't planned at all, and where you do go off on a little bit of a tangent, and you sort of go off script, and you find things out about yourself. It's kind of like you're on a sort of riverbank, and the river is the imagination, and you've got your sort of fishing rod, and then there'll be this fish that you didn't even know was in the river, and it will pop up, and it's like amazing, and then you'll put the fish back in the river because just
sometimes they're weird fish.
But then so that's, I don't know what I'm talking about, but basically that's essentially what I'm saying, that I'm very improvised, and I kind of like that process, because I feel like I don't know, that's how dreams work, isn't it? You don't necessarily know. And it does get me into all sorts of problems when I come to the editorial phase. And so most of the structuring and stuff happens in editing, and I'm very lucky that I've got good editors.
Yeah.
I think with me, it makes it a better book, ends up being a better book for those sort of improvised early phases. You obviously have to do some work on like character and development. With the Midnight Library, though, I was so convinced it was going to be determined it was going to be a fable kind of book. I almost wanted, like, I started off with a lot of character in terms of Nora, a lot of description. There's a lot of physical description that I took out because I kind of wanted the reader to be able to place themselves in Nora's position. And you can sometimes give too much. You can actually say, you know, she's wearing this tweed jacket and she's, you know, got wrinkles and she's got this and she does this with her hair. And you're saying, and the more you describe, you more readers thinking, well, I don't do that. So this is an interesting character, but it's not me. And with Nora, I wanted, you know, it to sort of like the reader to be able to put themselves in her shoes.
Yeah, sort of every woman. Yeah. What, you know, with what you just said about how you've got your process, other writers have theirs, you know, of course, it's going to depend on the writer and the book and the project. But are there any pieces of advice you would give to young career or early career authors or people that are interested in writing a book and how to keep going? Because I know it can sometimes be a daunting endeavor.
Yeah, and obviously the book was, and I started in 2004 was when I had my first book published, and the book world has changed so much since then. Yeah. I mean, it's basically changed how you do it. I mean, you used to always send off your physical manuscript, you used to print it out, you used to read the printed version, then you send it out, and that's changed a lot. I think how I became published was, well, I feel like you first of all obviously need to write something that you're proud of and that you're honest to yourself about. And I think you can often have too much advice. Like I had so much advice about looking at the market, doing market research and like that. And ultimately that's not that useful because for two reasons. One, you're not going to write precisely what you want to write. And the best stuff you will write is stuff you actually want to write. You need to write the book that you want to read that doesn't exist. So that's the perfect book for you to write. And so following the market automatically goes against that because you're automatically imitating other people, looking out. And also the market that you see when you walk into a bookstore is what writers were writing at least 2 years ago, a lot of the time. So it's always a little bit, you know, you don't know what the market's going to be by the time your book's out and stuff. So you're always a bit behind. So you have to just trust yourself and write what you want. And also be resilient. In my case, I had a lot of rejection letters. And I almost welcomed them because a lot of them actually contained advice. And I didn't ever go on a creative writing course, but my creative writing course was rejection letters. So I would get a lot of agents who would read it, but then they would tell me what was wrong with it or why. And I'd take a lot of it on board and learn. And I think it's about seeing it as a process. And also to remember that actually whatever, and I've had all kinds of different, my graph of career has been, I was struggling writer for ages, even in England, I was struggling writer. Then I had one book do well, and then I was dropped by my publisher 10 years ago. Then I was sort of back to square one, and then I took on with a publisher, and I've sort of had a more old-fashioned career path where I've grown readers book by book, which has been nice. But I would say resilience is a massive thing, and also, yeah, just actually be brutally honest with yourself and to enjoy the writing, because actually whatever stage you're at, the writing is the thing you need to enjoy the writing. Not all of it, because some of it is work and some of it, in my case, this sort of third, fourth draft becomes a nightmare. But there has to be some of it you enjoy. There has to be this buzz you get out of writing itself, because that remains the best bit of writing. Right. Like I love doing events like this. I love doing like tours and promo and things like that. I love it, you know, seeing people saying nice things about work. But still, the best bit remains the bit that is accessible to everybody, which is the actual writing. If you're just as how, I don't know, a dancer or a painter has to enjoy the act of dancing and painting, and that doesn't really change at whatever stage they're at in their career. So the writing is the thing that always stays the same. So you could be seen as a sort of like an unknown writer, a struggling writer, an underrated writer, an overrated writer, whatever it is. But whatever, at the end of the day, the writing stays the same. You know, the rest of it is just kind of noise outside of it. And when you're writing a new novel, you have to sort of go back into that space and to write what you want. And I actually love that. I love the possibility that you have this blank Word document in front of you, and you can literally go anywhere and to sort of shut out all the expectations and just write what you want. Because that's the hard thing. The hard thing is that as soon as people have read you, they then want you to write another version of what they know you for.
Right.
They want, I don't know, they want the midday video store.
Sorry.
They don't want the Hansel and Gretel book. They want the midday videos.
Yeah,
so
it's all just Hugo.
Yeah, exactly. But you have to kind of just
right.
do what you want to do. If you want to do exactly what you wrote before, then that's fine. But it has to be honest. It has to be because you want to do it. You know?
Right. Right. Are there any, since we've got a lot of book lovers listening, are there any books you've read recently that you just loved, that you would recommend, that you would pass along?
Well, there's a book that's not a novel, which really helped me last year. And I don't know if it's got a terrible cover, terrible jacket in the America, but it's got a really bad one here. But it's called When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron, which is just, she's a Buddhist, American turned Tibetan Buddhist. And it's a very small book. And it's about grief, it's about loss, it's all about all these bleak things, but it's so sort of hopeful and full of nourishing life advice. It's not really a self-help book as such. It's just a very contemplative book. I like everything that Anne Lamott writes. I've been reading the Grimm fairy tales again. I think that they are incredible, and they're so much darker and weirder than people
right. Yeah.
think. They're really strange.
Yeah.
And what else have I been reading? Yeah, I'll stick with them. I've mentioned Thoreau. I'll stick with them. But yeah, when Things Fall Apart was a real thing for me last year. I was reading lots of ancient philosophy as well. I was reading the Epictetus, who's this ancient Greek philosopher before Socrates, who'd been a slave. He'd been in pain all his life, and then he was freed, and he ended up with some of the most amazingly wise lines that have ever been written. Apparently, one of his lines became the foundation for cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, in the 1960s. Yeah, it was, what was it? It was about how basically people don't have they can't change external things, but what they can change is their response to those external things. It's a basis for that strand of therapy. But all his writings on Stoicism, I find very useful in hard times. I should have had a novel as well, but anyway, that's what comes.
Great list. So we need to wrap up pretty soon. So I think the last question I want to ask you is if readers could take one thing away from the Midnight Library, what would you like them to take away from it?
Well, obviously, I hope people will get entertained by it. But the reason I wrote it really was to be able to accept and see the magic in the life that we find ourselves in. And it's never the perfect life where nothing goes wrong. It's always the imperfect life. It's always the life where we've had failures and rejections and things that didn't go right, and we've disappointed people and we lost friends along the way. But it's still this magic human existence, which we're not always mindful of. So it's that sense of self-acceptance and accepting the sort of wonder and magic of where we are, because every life contains the ability to feel magical things there.
That's wonderful. Well, on that note, Matt Haig, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everyone who has tuned in today. This was a wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.